for flatness. In general, the check involves positioning the straight edge parallel to, at right angles, and diagonally to the length of the cylinder head. Pay particular attention to the areas between the bores, since warpage in these areas is likely to result in a failure to seal. The service manuals contain specifications for cylinder head flatness, so be sure to consult the one for the engine you're working on. You can use the same method to check the block deck for flatness. In some cases, if the warpage is relatively minor, you can consult your local machine shop or cylinder head reconditioner to bring it within specs. Keep in mind, however, that machining affects a number of other components, such as the valve train and manifolds, so be sure to follow the recommendations and the appropriate service manual concerning machining cylinder heads and blocks. Besides warpage, there are other problems that can affect sealing, such as corrosion, pitting, and gouges on the sealing surfaces. Pay particular attention to the areas between combustion chambers and around coolant passages, since these are most likely to leak if there is severe surface damage. And don't overlook the corresponding areas on the engine, particularly if it has an aluminum block. Cracks are another problem you'll need to inspect the cylinder head and block for. Pay particular attention to the areas around valve seats. Once you're sure you have a cylinder head and block that will seal properly with the new gasket, you are ready to reassemble the engine components. Before we move on to that part of our program, try this review question to check your knowledge of inspection methods. Technician A says that cylinder head bolts are not reusable. Technician B says that you need to measure each bolt's diameter with the dial caliper before reusing it. Who is correct? A only, B only, C, both A and B, or D, neither A nor B? The correct answer is D. You can reuse cylinder head bolts provided you check them for stretch by placing a straight edge against the threads and looking for gaps. When installing a new gasket on the cylinder block, there are a few things to keep in mind. For one thing, some gaskets, such as the multi-layer steel replacement head gaskets, discussed in TSB 9598, must be coated with Mopar aerosol gasket sealant or its equivalent before installation. Some sealants can damage head gasket coatings, and not all gaskets use a sealant, so be sure to check the instructions for the gasket you are installing. The next thing to be aware of when installing a new gasket is that it's possible to install some gaskets incorrectly. Make sure the part number on the gasket is facing up and the oil holes aligned. Installing a gasket incorrectly can route oil to the wrong passages and cause severe damage to the engine. And on gaskets for V-type engines, be aware that some applications use right and left gaskets that should not be switched. Earlier we described how to inspect cylinder head bolts to make sure they are reusable. Once you've replaced those that are not, lightly oil the bolt threads prior to installation. Do not squirt oil into the bolt holes. Bolts that have a Dackerman coating, such as those used on Viper, and bolts that you need to apply thread sealer to should not be oiled. When placing the head bolts in their proper positions, keep in mind that some bolts may be shorter than others. For example, on 2-liter single and dual overhead cam engines, the bolts at the corner locations are shorter. On some engines, some of the cylinder head attaching bolts are smaller and in locations that may not be readily apparent. On the 4.7-liter engine, there are 4 smaller bolts at the front of each cylinder head. These bolts are also special because instead of being lightly oiled, they must be coated with thread sealant prior to installation. On the 2.7-liter engine, there are 3 smaller bolts at the front of each cylinder head. On all engines, tightening the cylinder head bolts must occur in a numbered sequence, a sequence that generally works outward in both directions from a starting point in the middle and that requires multiple steps to achieve the final torque. On the engines we've been discussing, there is an additional step that involves tightening the bolt an additional 90 degrees. This method of tightening the bolts is referred to as the torque angle method. Let's look at this sequence on Neon with a single overhead cam engine. The first step is to tighten all the bolts to 25 foot-pounds using the sequence specified in the service manual. Then, tighten the bolts in sequence to 50 foot-pounds. The third step is to go over all the bolts in sequence again with the torque wrench set at 50 foot-pounds. The final step is to turn each bolt an additional 90 degrees using the same sequence. Notice that we do not use a torque wrench for this final step. That's because a torque wrench handle can move without actually turning the bolt. Be sure to consult the appropriate service manual and relevant TSBs for cylinder head bolt installation procedures and specifications. While we're on the subject of torque, you need to be aware of a change in specifications for dual overhead cam 2-liter engines being fitted with a multi-layer steel head gasket. This change is spelled out in the TSB we've been referring to, 9598. As before, the corner bolts are tightened to 20 foot-pounds during the first step. On the second and third steps, however, the bolts are tightened to 35 foot-pounds. The rest of the tightening procedure remains the same. Oh, and by the way, the smaller bolts at the front end of the cylinder heads we've been talking about do not use the torque angle method for tightening. See the appropriate service manual for the correct torque specifications for these bolts. Next, we're going to look at some follow-up procedures that help ensure the new gasket can do its job. First, though, try this review question. It's a good idea to stop the tape to discuss the question and answers as well as the material in this segment before moving on to the next segment. Which of the following statements about cylinder head installation are true? A, never use spray sealant on the gaskets. B, oil all cylinder head bolts. C, tighten all bolts an additional 90 degrees as a final step. Or D, none of the above. The correct answer is D, none of the above. Some gaskets do use spray sealants. Not all cylinder head bolts are oiled, and not all cylinder head bolts are tightened an additional 90 degrees. It doesn't do much good to replace a cylinder head gasket if the conditions that caused it to fail are still present. If engine overheating caused the cylinder head or block to warp, you're going to have to discover the cause. Of course, you'll want to start with the cooling system by checking for anything that is preventing the system from doing its job. Is the system leaking? Are the cooling fans doing their job? Is the thermostat faulty? Is the water pump circulating coolant? Is there a blockage in the radiator or coolant passages? Besides warpage, overheating can also cause detonation and pre-ignition that can damage the cylinder head gasket. Besides overheating, there are a number of other areas you'll need to examine if detonation or pre-ignition caused the cylinder head seal to fail. Was the owner using low-octane fuel? Is the NOx sensor working? Is the EGR operating? Are there carbon deposits on the pistons? Is something leaning out?